This summer, students from Sunnybrook and other churches all around Oklahoma attended MOVE, a Christ in Youth conference. We learned about Joseph in Genesis, and through some creative illustrations we were taught how he used his life to serve God, rather than using his past as an excuse. This series will follow that model and further look at several outstanding examples of biblical figures who didn't let their shortcomings stop them from serving God and his kingdom. Instead, they rose up to meet the unlikely odds and let God do the rest. We're called to do likewise and rise up. CIY call these people kingdom workers. We all have our own story. For better or worse, these are the things in our past, things that we've done that can define us, that do define us. Too often we live in the present, still focused on the past. It's almost natural to live this way, translating our shortcomings into excuses. After all, psychologically, this is how we as humans learn and make decisions, basing our future choices on past experiences. However, as Christians, God is an essential part of our lives. He changes the scope of the past, present, and future entirely. No longer does it matter what we've done, God will use us to glorify Him, so long as we're willing. God says, "I will use the weak to humble the strong. I will use the broken to redeem the lost." Was Paul in his lifetime always as we remember him today? No. God changed him. God knew his potential and used him to serve his kingdom, with extraordinary and resounding effects on our lives today. Abraham, Moses, David, Peter, the list is endless. There are many examples throughout Hebrews 11 and 12 of outstanding men and women, and innumerable instances of faith fill the entire Bible. Tonight we're going to talk about Gideon. Gideon's story is in the 7th book of the Bible, Judges, chapters 7 and 8, and accounts for most of the Judges portion of Israel history. This time period was something of a roller coaster for God's people, constantly being redeemed, then failing again and again to obey God's laws. God would redeem them, and the cycle would begin again. In Gideon's time, Israel had once again disobeyed God and was under the thumb of the Midianites. If you'll recall, Moses had intermarried with the Midianites during his exile from Egypt. Contrary to God's explicit instruction not to, the Israelites continued to disobey God after their exodus, so God gave them to their enemies. Gideon's story begins in a wine press. Think of a hole in the ground, and in the center of the hole there is another deeper hole for the wine to run off into and be collected. But Gideon wasn't making wine, he was threshing wheat. Why was he in the wine press? The Bible says, to keep it from the Midianites. Even in biblical times, wine was something of a delicacy. If your country has been taken over, think of Animal Farm or Red Dawn, there wouldn't have been many parties for the now enslaved population. The wine press probably wasn't popular at this time, and instead of holding wine, it was used to secretly grow a meager amount of food. This verges on pitiful, not merely those facts in and of themselves, but that Gideon was scared of the Midianites. He was a far cry from a hero. Even so, an angel from God appeared to Gideon and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Note Gideon's response. Gideon contests the first part of the statement, "The Lord is with you," rather than the second part. It's as if to him that this remark was even more absurd than the second, calling him a mighty warrior. He and the angel trade words, and after God consumes Gideon's offering with a gout of fire, Gideon realizes that it really is the angel of God, at which point he's terrified. So far he's not shown many qualities of a warrior. And this is where Gideon borders on daft. Keep in mind, Gideon just built an altar to God and just watched it go up in flames. You'd think that if God told you to do something after that experience, you'd be empowered with some sort of righteous adrenaline or motivation. God commanded that he deface the false religious symbols of his family and community, rather than go out immediately and obey God. Gideon, because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, waited until it was dark. His life must have been tough to be the weakest man in the weakest clan, afraid not only of the foreign overlords but of your family and neighbors. Gideon was almost successful in his anti-Baal espionage, but the next morning the townspeople identified him as the perpetrator. His neighbors demanded his life. But false idol defacing or not, their dispute was quickly forgotten, because at just that time the surrounding clans decided to converge and to attempt to take back Israel from the Midianites by force. Now the story begins to change. At this point, it gets to be unbelievable. It's set up for a classic God-style intervention. With tremendous odds stacked against Gideon, nothing short of a miracle will save him. Gideon, despite his lowly status both in his family and in his community, winds up as a ranking officer in the Israelite army. He has about 32,000 men under his command. But God, ever one for impossible odds, like Benaiah with the pit on a lion in a snowy day, tells Gideon that he has too many soldiers. To put it into perspective, the Midianite kings together had 135,000 soldiers, a 1-to-4 man ratio. Gideon sends home some of his men, the ones who are scared and unwilling. That leaves only 10,000 men for Gideon, a 1-to-7 ratio. But these numbers are still too evenly matched for God. Gideon has the remaining soldiers go down to the river and drink water. Based on some arbitrary criteria, the army is further eliminated. There are only 300 men left, a 1-to-450 ratio. This part made me laugh because it's so implausible that God's hand in this is clear. When scouting out the camp of the Midianites, Gideon overhears some soldiers having a conversation. Judges 7:13-14 reads, "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Each man had a torch, jar, and trumpet. Making a bunch of commotion, they overran the camp and forced the Midianites into retreat. A few small details in the conclusion of this story are a perfect illustration for the underlying theme. As they are giving chase to the retreating Midianite forces, Gideon's troops become tired. Gideon stops in a few local villages demanding, not timidly asking, for food. When he is refused, he basically says, "I'll remember this. You're next." As you can see, by the end of the story, Gideon is, indeed, a mighty warrior. God can use you no matter what you've done. As embodied by every biblical character ever, God can use you to do incredible things. Nothing you have done or will ever do will disqualify you from serving Him. All that's required is the will to serve. So the next time you're struggling in your walk or don't feel like you amount to much or are unable to draw near to God, just remember, we are not defined by our worst moment, but by His greatest moment.